Ας αρχίσουμε. Να σας καλωσορίσω σε αυτό το ένατο συνέδριο των σύγχρονων τάσεων στην κλασική φιλολογία, όπως λέγεται στα ελληνικά. Θα μου επιτρέψετε να απευθυνθώ πρώτα στα εγγλέζικα στους καλεσμένους μας. Just a few words of welcome to all of you, old and new friends of Trends in Classics Conference, which is now organized for its 9th consecutive year, a difficult year in a country apparently bankrupt, an almost failed state as we are used to be called. I'm sure you will not notice many signs of an imminent disaster if you enjoy nightlife in Thessaloniki this evening or tomorrow. All this year's conferences would be possible without the help of many people, colleagues and students. I will mention just two: Evina Sistakou, who organized also this year's conference, and Stavros Frangoulidis, responsible for the Latin conferences. This year's conference is being co-organized by the Department of Classics of our university and the Center for Greek Language, a research center here in Thessaloniki. Two members of his staff, Maria Rapopoulou and Katerina Ziana, have worked for this conference. A warm thank to both of them. I don't have anything else to say. Just enjoy your stay in Thessaloniki and also the conference. Franco Montanari, the co-editor of the series Trends in Classics, published by De Gruyter in Berlin, will say a few words.
Thank you, Professor Angakos. Dear friends and colleagues in Thessaloniki, speakers and participants in this conference, ladies and gentlemen, I must say that it is always a great pleasure for me to be in Thessaloniki for several reasons. Not only to attend interesting conferences with important scholarly participation, but also to meet up with a circle of long-standing friends and make interesting new acquaintance. Today, we are opening the 9th Trends in Classics International Conference, which is devoted to the general theme of the Greek epigrams. The achievement of this important series of conferences are to be attributed mainly to the hard work, intelligence, and reputation of a group of scholars of the Department of Classics of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and under the chair or the influence of my old friend Antonios Angakos. And this yearly gathering has become one of the major events in the international panorama of classical studies. As it is known, and as Professor Angakos just mentioned, the proceedings of this Thessaloniki conference are published in the series Trends in Classics supplementary volume, of which Antonios and I are the editors. One of the main virtues, indeed, perhaps the only one to have any real value in order to follow the example of Professor Angakos, that is truly appreciated in welcome speeches and in the inaugural ceremonies and greetings at the scientific and cultural events such as today's, is brevity. Brevity is the soul of wit, to quote from another literary classic, albeit of a rather different kind, that is to say Shakespeare. But for our purpose, it is also the best way to avoid any delay in the opening of the conference activities, allowing us to proceed forward to the scholarly presentation that the Assembly is looking forward to hearing. Thus, I will continue no further, other than to wish all those assembled here an enjoyable and productive working experience at this conference, and allow me to thank once again all the Thessaloniki staff and all the participants and speakers to this conference on the Greek epigrams. Thank you very much.
The introduction will be held by an old, a very old friend of Thessaloniki and of mine, Professor Richard Hunter of the University of Cambridge. Richard.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Does everyone at least have the sight of a handout? If not, I know that there are plentiful supplies. Okay. Well, let me begin by adding my welcome to you all, and I do so much to everyone's surprise, as still, at least when I last looked, President of the Council of the Aristotle University. Now, whether my continued existence or that of the Council itself is the cause for greater surprise, I will leave to others to decide. What I do want to stress, however, is that in very, very difficult circumstances, Thessaloniki has an extraordinary record of every year hosting major international conferences on ancient literature. What you see around you is one of the most remarkable phenomena in our subject anywhere in the world. We, and I now speak as a member of the family of the Aristotle University, are very grateful that you have made the trip and that you are here with us today. These are, however, as you all know, very trying times for Greece generally, but particularly also for Greek studies in Greece, and for Greek universities and the ideals of humane studies more generally. Everyone who professes an interest in the study of the ancient world should, I think, care about the situation of such studies in Greece. May I therefore ask you, nay, entreat you, to be interested not just, as I am, in the pleasures of being in Thessaloniki and the marvelous hospitality you will find here, but to care about our subject enough to learn about what is actually going on here, and if necessary, make your voice heard when the wolf, both academic and financial, is really at the door. When, for example, library budgets are cut so that they eventually bleed to death. When the position of younger academics can seem irretrievably hopeless. And governing principles such as transparency and meritocracy are not merely laudantur et algent, as Juvenal might have said, but are openly ridiculed at the highest levels. Something very precious is at stake, and those of you like myself who come from other and in many cases more privileged academic environments can indeed help. This is not, of course, a matter of party politics, Greek or other. It is a matter of how important we think our own subject and the whole notion of open and fearless research, teaching, and administration is. For myself, I have no doubts on that subject, and that is why I, for one, am still here, well, at least until Sunday. Now, one thing that Greek epigrams and conferences on Greek epigram have in common is that there are a lot of them. Unlike epigrams, however, the conferences tend to be rather long. In this case, however, the menu of the Cana Dubia, which awaits us in the next 2.5 days, suggests that, like Philodemus's guests, we will get a cuisine which is truly nouvelle. The choice of the organizers to focus on dialect, diction, and style in epigram is, in my view, particularly welcome, as these areas are too often sidelined in the understandable search for what does this poem mean. Moreover, diction and style allow us to take a view of the history of epigram which is both synoptic, embracing the earliest inscribed examples, and also properly respectful of diachronic change over time. The history of Greek poetic style has never properly been written, though there are people in this room who have contributed greatly to our understanding of some of the issues involved. And when it does come to be written, then epigram will have an honored place, precisely because of the corpus of inscribed texts. Whether or not inscription makes a difference to diction and style is one of the things I hope to learn about in the coming days. Now, if you open at random any collection of either inscribed or what we call literary epigrams, then a whole host of questions is bound to come tumbling out. I actually tried this experiment, And though I confess to having cheated at the end, I cheated only by 1 page. SGO 01 2025 from Miletus on your handout was chosen, well, almost at random. And in the next few minutes, I want to look at it with you, partly to illustrate the kinds of questions, or some of the kinds of questions, I hope we will be pursuing at this conference. An epitaph, appropriately enough in iambic trimeter, for a tragic poet of perhaps the middle-ish 2nd century before Christ, is followed on the same stone by an elegiac poem for apparently a man with philosophical pretensions. The latter poem is, according to the experts, notably later than the trimeters, so probably 1st century before Christ. It is of some interest to find such literary and highbrow interests, but of very different kinds, running in the same family. You will see from the photograph of the stone that the elegiacs have been fitted into the space available, using, as we would say, a different font size. There are, in fact, 3 font sizes on the stone. Does this difference affect how we read? And we read, I think, descendingly rather than condescendingly. If, of course, and here, of course, I'm looking at Peter Bing, we are actually reading this. Be that as it may, I think it can be argued that the poet of the elegiacs calls our attention to the position of the poem on the stone, both through tumbos hod ek progonon in verse 6 or verse 2, and through shared elements of vocabulary, however common they might be. One poem follows the other in more ways than one, just as pious living, Eusebia, runs through the generations. Do allusivity and intertextuality function differently when we can see the poems physically juxtaposed in front of us? Who, moreover, wrote these poems? Professional poets working to commission and instruction, or the dead themselves? Should, moreover, we hold the long 2nd syllable of kekrufa in verse 2 against whoever wrote the iambics? Questions of linguistic level and register are probably nowhere as difficult as in the field of epigram. The accusative graphe in verse 1 is probably simply a current koine form rather than a choice poeticism, even for a tragic poet, or even a doricism, as the grammatical tradition would have it. But what are we to make of hotumbitas petros? The adjective is found in only one other place in the texts known to TLG, namely in an epitaph for a grasshopper by Leonidas, passage 2 on your handout, where we have the expression laas hotumbites with the expected ionic ending. In Leonidas, we might suspect a choice poeticism in keeping with the very idea of a stone memorial for a grasshopper or a cricket. But what about on the inscription? Was perhaps the word more common than our texts suggest? Or is it too in a style appropriate to a tragic poet? And or is it relevant that ites, and so forth, was a productive suffix for the naming of kinds of stones and gems? And finally, why the long alpha ending? The phenomenon is, of course, very familiar, and both Catherine Gutzwiller and Alex Sens, to roam no further afield, have shed important light upon it. But is it here another touch of the other to gesture towards the diction of a tragic poet? It is joined in the elegiacs by, for example, the Doric endings of verse 10. Issues of register of a different kind are raised by hedonikais in verse 8. The adjective can, particularly in later and Byzantine texts, just mean given to or addicted to pleasure or causing pleasure. But next to Epicurean, it can hardly fail to evoke a technical usage, to refer first to Aristippus and the Cyrenian hedonist school, and secondly to the Epicureans themselves, as it standardly is in the late commentators. We should translate it here as something like hedonist, precisely to catch this quasi-technical flavor. Whoever composed this poem certainly knew something. Louis Robert pointed out that kenais doxais in the first hexameter of the elegiacs may be a sharp allusion to Epicurus's Kyriai doxai, but we can perhaps go a little further. The most important Kyria doxa in this context must of course be the second, death is nothing to us. For this poem and this stone proclaim a radically different view of the afterlife. Secondly, Epicurus and his followers were loud in their attacks on the kenaidoxai, or kenodoxia, or as Diogenes of Oinaanda put it, pseudodoxia, with which our lives are too full and which disturb our serenity with false imaginings. An epigram of quite uncertain date, except that it is earlier than Diogenes Laertius, about Epicurus by one Athenaeus, passage 3 on your handout, also highlights this aspect of Epicurean thought. Now that poem, SH 225, would repay a much closer look than time allows me here. But verses 3 to 4 of that poem very obviously paraphrase Kyriai doxai 15, which is also on your handout, as very remarkably, I think, Dennis Page in further Greek epigrams does not seem to have realized. And so this illustrates how kenaidoxai was an instantly recognizable Epicurean idea put in our poem to a novel use. The author of our elegiacs pointedly suggests then that Epicurus's Kyriai doxai are the ultimate example of kenaidoxai, against which the Epicureans themselves were thought to campaign. The point is a very sharp one, and once again raises the question of who wrote this poem. Now, the language of the final couplet is entirely standard. The aisles or chambers of the pious or blessed are a common destination in epitaphic epigram. One of the questions, however, which epigrams, both literary and inscribed, constantly raise is how and when such standard, formulaic, if you like, language can be given a specific contextual charge. In the present case, we may ask where we would expect a follower of Socrates and Plato to go after death. Almost no issue, of course, could so separate a Platonist, for whom, as indeed for the popular religion of Greek epitaph more generally, all soul is immortal, from an Epicurean. Now, more than one answer to the question, where would a Platonist go after death, is possible for the late Hellenistic period. But an obvious place to start would be with the two texts with which Hestiaios himself probably started. In Plato's Apology, Socrates offers two possibilities for what might happen to us after death. One, the absence of any perception whatsoever, might be thought to be in some ways one of the intellectual ancestors of the Epicurean view, though of course very different from it. The other being the soul's removal to another place, Hades, where the soul will find real judges, such as Minos and Rhadamanthus, and one's stay, apodhemia, offers one the chance to converse with such as Orpheus and Homer, or Palamedes and Ajax, or Odysseus and Sisyphus, and indeed to question them to discover who is wise and who only thinks he is wise. Socrates does not actually call this afterworld the land of the blessed or any such thing. But he does say that those who are there are eudaimonesteroi, than people here, and also that one will find there all the demigods who were just during their own lives, a description which might well be thought to conjure up Hesiod's description of the fate of his hemithioi, a juster and better race, who after death live happy on the islands of the blessed, beside deep eddying ocean. My guess is that, particularly for the more literate consumers, Socrates' description was influential upon images of the afterlife. And if you ask where Socrates, or Socrates' soul himself, went, then the answer would be to a kind of islands, or indeed chambers, thalamoi, of the blessed, the pious, the good, whatever. Some support for this, I think, is to be found in Lucian's Island of the Blessed in the True Histories, where indeed Rhadamanthus holds sway, Socrates chats with Palamedes just as the Apology forecast, and Homer and Odysseus are also prominent inhabitants. Lucian, of course, never borrows straight from a classical text, so Plato is absent because he lives in his own fictional city, as are the Stoics, still stuck somewhere up the mountain of virtue, whereas both Aristippus and Epicurus are in residence because they are both party animals and so contribute to the general jollity. Now, this clearly is not quite what Histiaios had in mind, but we may be sure that he did have a clear idea what the chambers of the pious looked like. For him and for his poet, this was not an empty epitaphic formula. Socrates' final words in the Apology must indeed have offered comfort to many a Socratic. Now the time has come to depart, me to death and you to life. Which of us goes to a better state is known to no one except the god. Now, the other relevant Platonic text is, of course, the Phaedo, where Socrates describes the fates which await different people depending on how they have lived their lives. Unsurprisingly, perhaps the most blessed fate awaits those who have been purified by philosophy and those who have, like Histiaios, we might feel tempted to say, rejected bodily pleasures, pursued learning, and adorned their souls with the cardinal virtues. It is they who can look forward to the journey after death with confidence. Socrates, for one, is confident that he is about to depart for the happinesses of the blessed, which evokes, without specifying, the islands or chambers of the blessed. Once again, we may feel sure that Histiaios took comfort from Socrates and Plato as to what lay ahead of him. An epitaph for Plato, ascribed to Speusippus, places the philosopher's soul precisely among the blessed. Wherever we look, then, questions come tumbling out. But epigrams, as we all know, can weary by their very number. And with that weariness can come, expertus dico, a dulled sensitivity as to the specialness of each individual poem. Now, this, of course, is the very last audience to whom a dulled literary sensibility should be attributed, even on a Friday morning. But the very number of extant poems and their brevity does, I think, place special demands upon our critical faculties and can sometimes stop us asking from each and every poem, what is it exactly that we want to learn, and then how does this poem contribute to our sense of the bigger picture? It is, I suppose, above all, the bigger picture which is at stake in this conference. And it is by that bigger picture that we shall probably all be judged when we too come to stand before Minos and Rhadamanthus. So it is time to get going. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hunter, for this introduction and this analysis of these epigrams. And we are starting the first session of this morning, and I invite the two speakers to join me at the table. I see that I have a very dangerous piece of paper for you. They are not being supplied by me, the organization. So the first session is devoted to Doric dialect in epigram, and the first speaker is D. Clayman, professor of classics and in the City University of New York. Professor Clayman Is the pronunciation correct of your name, Clayman?
Clayman, yes.
Okay. He's an expert in Hellenistic poetry. And a well-known scholar in a number of fields, and is currently also president of the Société Internationale de Bibliographie Classique, which is the publisher of the Année Philologique, but she has been also president of the American Philological Association in the academic year 2010-2011. The title of the paper of Professor Clayman is Callimachus Doric Graecis. Please.
Thank you, Franco. I'm very pleased to be here today and to be able to exploit the opportunity of being first on the program to thank you and Professors Ringakos and Sistakou and the whole staff for organizing this wonderful conference. It's never an easy thing to do, and even harder under the current circumstances. But it's vitally important for the progress of scholarship and for building an international scholarly community. So thank you. And let me begin with the discussion of Callimachus's 15th epigram. This short epigram, it's item number 1 on your handout, has had quite a lot of scholarly attention due to its charm, I think, as is suitable for a poem on the Graces, and also due to its intriguing ambiguities. These were set out very clearly in an excellent paper published in 2003 by the Petroviches. They're right here in this room, I think, along with almost everyone else who's written anything interesting about this epigram, and Callimachus. The citations on your handout. Unlike most epigrams, which fit neatly into one of the well-defined subgenres of the epigram, the Petroviches show how this particular one can be classified in several different subgenres. It could be an erotic poem, as the ancient editors apparently thought, a dedicatory poem for a newly made statue, as many readers believe, an epideictic poem, which is a type of art criticism, or, as they finally conclude, a literary dedication that announces the addition of books 3 and 4 to the first 2 books of Callimachus's Aetia. This last interpretation was developed in a somewhat different way by Ben Acosta Hughes and Susan Stevens in 2012. So, after all this learned discussion, you may wonder if there's anything else to say about this little poem. And with only 20 minutes to speak, you can be sure I won't be adding much. But I do want to focus on an aspect that has not yet been part of the discussion: dialect. My goal is to show how Callimachus uses dialect in this epigram as a rhetorical strategy. Now, 15 is one of a handful of Callimachus's epigrams that contain more than a few Doric word forms. This is, of course, literary Doric, not a language that anyone actually spoke, but a selection of Doric forms, mostly inherited from earlier literature, mixed with others, including Homeric, poetic, and Koine. The text of Callimachus's Doric poems are slippery objects of study because ancient editors and copyists had a tendency to substitute unfamiliar spellings for standard ones. Oops, I've lost my second page. And modern editors tend to do the opposite. They correct standard spellings with Doric ones. And we'll see 2 examples of this in a moment, which I will argue are both ill-conceived. But editing is not the whole story. Dialect instability is found in inscribed epigrams in the 3rd century BC, as Koine begins to assert itself against dialogues generally. And Alex Sens has shown in his groundbreaking article of 2004 that it characterizes the text of the new Posidippus, which were produced within a generation of the poet's death in the 3rd century BC. This, in turn, Sens argues, implies that Posidippus himself was the source of the dialect mix, and that dialect itself could be an element in the poet's toolbox. Callimachus's famous pronouncement on dialect mixing in IM 13 seems to corroborate this. Now, let's consider Callimachus 15 GP. Why Callimachus chose to use Doric here is not a mystery. The subject of his poem, named in line 3, is Berenike. This is generally agreed to be Berenike II, the wife of Ptolemy III and Callimachus's great patron. It's significant that the poet uses the Doric form of her name here, Berenika. Both Callimachus and Berenike were from Cyrene and native Doric speakers. He's not speaking Cyrenean here, and we do not know whether he ever had opportunities in real life to chat with her in the accents of their native city. But it is self-evident that he exploited their common homeland to claim a special relationship with her in the endless game of one-upsmanship that characterized life among the royal courtiers in Alexandria. I think we could also agree that she was among the intended readers of this poem. So this is a subtle, or not so subtle way, for Callimachus to remind her and everyone else of their shared linguistic heritage. Beyond her Cyrenean birth and childhood, Berenike is Doric by virtue of her family's Macedonian background. Her father, Magus, was a son of the first Berenike by her first husband, the otherwise unknown Philip. And we know from Posidippus 88 that Berenike I came from Macedonian Eordea, like her second husband, Ptolemy I. And so, the social and political values that became attached to Macedonian Doric speech by Callimachus's time, which are described by Richard Hunter in an article in 2005, are operative here. Part of this agenda was the myth of Macedonian ties to Doric-speaking Argos in the Peloponnese, which Callimachus highlights and associates with Berenike II in the beginning of the Victoria Berenike's, which also features Heracles, that quintessentially Doric hero. In short, Berenike II is 3 times Doric. Though Callimachus had personal and political motives for spelling her name in the Doric manner, he was not in the habit of doing so. In other places where he names his queen in extant poetry, she is Berenike, not Berenika. This form, as well as its accompanying adjective, aridzelos, is a literary reference, a quote from Theocritus 1757, the encomium to Ptolemy. The relevant verses are item 2 on your handout. Gao-Page explained, following Kaibel, that Berenika, at the end of the verse, violates a metrical rule observed by Callimachus in his elegies, that a 4-syllable word at the end of a verse with 2 breves followed by 2 longer must be preceded by a monosyllable, making a neat dactyl and spondy. There are a number of examples of verses that ignore this rule in Theocritus, but this is the only one in Callimachus. And that is the reason that they believe that the placement of the adjective and name in this position was not an independent choice of both poets, but that Callimachus plucked it from Theocritus. Theocritus's poem describes the birth of Ptolemy II, whose mother was Berenike I, and celebrates their closeness to the gods. The concept is reinforced by the adjective aridzelos, very conspicuous, which may be appropriately applied to both Berenikes. Now, aridzelos has struck some editors as an un-Doric form, and since Doric zalos is attested, Brunk and others have corrected it to aridzalos. But this would be a mistake, as Pfeiffer knew. Not only do the best manuscripts of Theocritus have aridzelos, but so does Pindar, and the spelling is backed up by evidence from inscriptions. We can be confident that it is correct and that the whole phrase is a literary reference intended to confer some of the weight of Theocritus's argument for the Ptolemies' divine, heroic, and Doric qualities on Callimachus's own slight epigram. Just as Theocritus tells us that Ptolemy II resembled his father, Ptolemy I, in the manner of Achilles and Diomedes, so Callimachus subtly suggests Berenike II resembles the first Berenike. There is point, then, to Berenike's Doricness, but our epigram doesn't begin with it. It opens with the startling fact that there are now more graces than there used to be. Tesseres hai harites. 4 are the graces. Tesseres is epic in form. The Doric would be tetores, which wouldn't scan, but that is not the only reason Callimachus chooses tesseres. In his brief narrative, the graces start with their epic Ionic identity, but by the end of line 4, hai harites have become tai harites. They turn into Doric graces right before our eyes. Though tai is also epic, it appears in Homer very rarely as an article followed by a noun, as it does here. Most of Homer's ties and toys are pronouns. To be precise, though, we could now say that the epic Ionic graces become epic Doric graces. Not only have the graces become Doricized, but they have multiplied. At the conclusion, hai harites are tai harites harites. The increase in number is the first message of the epigram, and it's reinforced by Callimachus's elegant word order. But how and when was the transition made? Let's go back to line 1. In addition to those 3, tais trisi kenais, a new one has just been created. Those 3, of course, are the traditional 3, the graces from the Ionic island of Paros, as the Petroviches note. They appear at the beginning of Book 1 of the Itia. And the manuscripts of the AP make their origin clear with kenais, an Ionic form equivalent to the Attic ekenais. You won't read this in Pfeiffer, though. He follows Wilemovitz in correcting kenais to the Doric tenais. The emendation was made on the grounds that Callimachus uses tenais consistently in his Doric hymns 5 and 6. But consistency is not a characteristic of Hellenistic poets using dialect forms. Galpage retained the manuscript reading, and I think they are right. Before the miraculous creation of a new grace, the original 3 were firmly epic Ionic. Now, in line 1, the new grace has not yet been identified. She is simply 1, Mia. This form is dialectically ambiguous. It could be Attic, but also West Greek and Epic. The first unambiguously Doric word is poti, which joins the 1 to the other graces, while it retains a distinction between them. This epic Doric 1 has been added to those Ionians. The 2 linguistic groups come together in a process that has just been completed as we begin line 2. Potiplaste, with its Doric prefix, reinforces the sound of poti in line 1. It was molded in addition to, or molded on, not simply added, as LSJ suggests, without offering any other examples. This is an act of creation and extension, equally suited to statuary and poetry. Though the verb by itself doesn't help us decide whether the poet is talking about a statue or a poem, it does suggest that the process it describes is Doricizing. It's not simply plaso or prosplaso, but potiplaso. It's a Doric fashioning that has just been completed as Callimachus begins his poem. At this point, the moment of inception has already passed, and the new creation is damp with perfume. The adverb eti is in Crassus Doric style with kai, right? We're now in Doric time. Note, it is damp, is not marked as Doric, but noteo is an interesting word. Its first appearance in Greek literature is right here. And the only other citations come from Eratosthenes, Callimachus' younger contemporary, and the still younger Nicander. Note is a Hellenistic formation, and it seems to have a somewhat scientific ring. In the Alexipharmaca, it's used with hydros, sweat, but also oil precisely as it's pressed out of olives. In Eratosthenes, it is the dampness from melting ice. The older, more usual form of the verb, notidzo, also refers to perspiration and other bodily fluids. In our epigram, the liquid in question is myrrh, a perfume, and a commonly repeated idea is that perfume was poured on or rubbed on the statue during its dedication ceremony. This notion was questioned by Gao Page, who note that there is no evidence that perfume was used in dedication ceremonies. And the Petroviches suggest that we should be thinking of oils rubbed on papyri to aid in their preservation. But the notion of pouring or anointing is absent from the poem itself, which offers only note. The new creation is wet with a liquid like sweat, freshly pressed olive oil, or water from melting ice. That is, a liquid that originates within its source and then appears on the surface. No agent applies it. This suggests, in turn, that Callimachus is in the presence of that uniquely Hellenistic marvel, a sweating statue. Sweating statues are omens, usually bad ones, and Posidippus includes one among his Enos Scopica. This is 30 AB. This is 30 AB, and it's number 3 on your handout. It's rather a schematic description of this phenomenon, which raises an alarm at the omen but offers a solution to the threat. Call upon the god who has perspired, and he will drive away the enemy. The omen need not be disastrous if it's met with supplication. Note the seamless transition from the perspiring statue to a perspiring god. The statue and the god are synonymous. Now, there's no prayer in Callimachus' epigram, but the suggestion that the statue is the same as its subject and that both have qualities of divinity is certainly present. Posidippus' word choice to express perspiration is hydroo, which has a more limited semantic range than noteo. It's always and only about sweat. But Callimachus' choice is appropriate because his sweating statue isn't exuding water, but perfume. And this is an even greater miracle. That Callimachus might present a sweating Berenike is not the least inappropriate. Consider Posidippus 36 AB. This well-known poem marks the dedication of a headband to Arsinui Philadelphus by a young girl who dreamed that the queen had used it, I don't think it's on the handout, to wipe the sweet sweat from her brow as she rested after heavy toils. Arsinui's sweat is sweet, glucose. But Callimachus goes one step further. Berenike, or should we say Berenika, sweats myrrh. If this is an omen, it's certainly a good one. Now, the third line of our epigram finally reveals the name of the newest grace, which is accompanied by some of her attributes, as if the poem were a very short hymn, right? In Callimachus, the generic mixing never stops. Ion, fortunate, Berenike, happy in life, and Eritzelos, very conspicuous. Though not Doric in form, both of these words appear elsewhere in the company of Doric. For example, Ion can be found with Olbistan in Callimachus' hymn to Athena. That's item number 4 on your handout, and more about that in a moment. But Both also appear elsewhere describing other Ptolemies. For example, Ion is attached to Ptolemy IV in an anonymous epigram in a school text, and Eratosthenes applies it to Ptolemy III, Berenike's husband. Likewise, Aritzelos, very conspicuous, which Theocritus uses to praise Berenike I, also appears in an anonymous fragment attributed to Callimachus himself as a characteristic of Ptolemy, the son of Logos. We could guess from these adjectives, coupled with names of the Ptolemies, that they were authorized epithets for Ptolemaic rulers, but they're not banal or irrelevant to this little poem. In Iliad 22 and Pindar, his second Olympian, Aritzelos describes a star, which recalls Berenike's lock, and also the star of Berenike in fragment 387, Pfeiffer, and reminds us of the Graces' association with light. Likewise, Ion often accompanies Apollo in tragedy, and his closeness to the Graces is very well attested. But there's an edge to Callimachus's praise, as if, like Pindar, he felt the need to remind his Laudanda that even Charis can have a dark side. In his fifth hymn, The Bath of Pallas, Ion describes the nymph Chariclo, whose son Tiresias has just been blinded because he inadvertently saw the goddess naked in her bath. The relevant lines are item 4 on the handout. Chariclo is blessed, but only in comparison with the mother of Actaeon, who suffered a much worse punishment for a similar crime. Blindness is a blessing in comparison with being torn apart and eaten by your dogs. And Aritzelos is also double-edged. In Iliad 22:27, it specifically describes the armor of Achilles, which shines like the light of the dog star, the brightest star of all, but a sign of evil. And Iliad 2:318 is also relevant. This concludes a passage that describes a portent, a serpent, which appears while the Greeks are sacrificing to the gods at Aulis. It jumps to a nearby tree where it eats 8 baby sparrows together with their mother. Then the poet says of the portent, and it's item 5 on your handout, the god who revealed it made it Aritzelon, that is, the son of crooked counseling Kronos, turned it to stone. As Schmidt notes, here we have a case where Aritzelos describes a living creature that is turned to stone. That is, it becomes a statue. The passage is a notorious crux. Aristarchus didn't like it at all. But in using this word to describe Berenike as a statue, Callimachus may be thinking not only of a divine portent turned to stone, but its ultimate form, the constellation Draco, which happens to be in the same family of constellations as the Coma Berenike's. Now, the fourth verse is the poem's elegant conclusion. Berenika, without whom the graces themselves are not graces. The relative pronoun has is Doric, like its referent, and now the article accompanying the graces is also Doric. So great is her power that though she is only one and they 3, the combined ensemble takes on her identity. They and she are all Doric now, and they have become indistinguishable, a group of 4 Doric graces. Now, to say that a queen is like a goddess, or in this case, like a grace, or that a queen is a grace, is not the height of poetic creativity. The conceit that a human could be like a deity begins with Homer and was taken to a new level of literalness by Alexander and his successors. But this isn't exactly Callimachus's point. By manipulating dialect forms, Callimachus has found a subtle way to say not only that Berenike has become a grace, but that the graces have become Berenike's. This puts a new spin on an old cliché and is a much greater compliment. The newly door-sized graces are also Callimachus's, uniquely Callimachus's. Now that Berenike has been grafted onto them, he no longer has to make do with the usual 3. Now he has a unique set of 4, specifically Dorian graces, to bring their many gifts to his work. These would include not only their inspiration and beauty, but their newly acquired financial and political clout. No one would doubt the power of that combination or Callimachus's success in forging it. It appears then that Callimachus uses dialect here, with all of its literary, social, and political connotations, to claim a unique and powerful position for himself and his art. And I use the word appears purposely to acknowledge the central weakness in this argument. It depends on accepting that the words of the poet are exactly as the textual tradition says. But we don't know that this is true. The manuscripts clearly have some errors, and especially where dialect is concerned, editors, ancient and modern, have confused the evidence. A particular set of readings that look artful and interesting in 2015 CE may not be what the poet intended after all. If Cainice in line 1 really was Tainice, as Wilemovitz thought, then my whole argument is destroyed. But this is not a unique situation. All texts that have come through the medieval manuscript tradition present these same difficulties. And yet we soldier on in the hopes that something true has survived. In this case, as always, I hope that it has. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Clement, for your talk and your analysis of the Doric features, of these supposed Doric features. And the next speaker is Ewan Bowie, currently Emeritus Fellow, if I am right, of Corpus Christi College in Oxford. Ewan Bowie is also a well-known scholar and gave important contribution in Greek elegiac and iambic poetry, on Aristophanes, Hellenistic poetry, Greek novel, and Greek prose and literary culture in the High Roman Empire. Today, his paper has the title Doing Doric, Dialect Choices by Phillips, Poets, and by Sacerdos. Please, Ewan.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers, all of them, senior and junior, who have done so much to make this very promising conference. Can everybody hear me? Is my distance from the microphone right? Nobody is saying no. I must apologize first for the length of my handout, which is perhaps inappropriate for a conference on small poetry and will probably be regarded by Richard as Stalinist in various ways. But it has a purpose. I'm going to take you very rapidly through many, or past many of these poems, that is, passing the inscribed texts in a way that Peter doubtless thinks that we sometimes did, or they sometimes did. This paper has two parts. First, some observations on the use of Doric by poets whose work has survived initially in the Garland and then via the anthology, and then a discussion of 5 poems from a sepulchral monument in Nicaea, which is preserved in book 15 of the anthology. Some of Philip's poets, especially of the middle and latter part of the 1st century BC, have no truck at all with Doric. So Philodemus, whose Gadarene origin makes this unsurprising, Diodorus of Sardis, perhaps also no surprise, but also Crinagoras, whose Mytilenean origin might have led us to expect at least a move away from Attic Ionic. And I've listed in handout 1 a number of poets who have no truck with Doric, poets responsible for several and sometimes for a few epigrams in the anthology. And even, for example, Parmenion does not use Doric in 10 Gower Page when he's talking about Spartans at Thermopylae, which you might expect a trigger for the use of Doric. In some poets who did choose Doric for some of their surviving poems, it might be argued that the dialect is chosen either when there is a thematic or a contextual trigger in the poem, or when the poem follows or refashions the work of an earlier poet strongly associated with Doric. And I have several examples now following in the handout. Thus, several poems using Doric evoke either a Leonidean or a Theocratian pastoral world, and may be using it to stress that aspect of the poem. So, item 2 in the handout of Myrrhinus's 4 poems, it is only 3 Gau page on Thyrsis asleep, handout 2 that uses Doric. Of Thallus's poems, it is 5 Gau page on sex under a plane tree entwined with a vine, handout 3, and a similar example is Aeneas 2, handout 4, a dedication by Crethon to Demeter in the Leonidean manner, as Gau page says. And I put there also on handout 4 the Leonidas poem that he is reworking, and where we actually have the name Crethon again. Both this sort of pastoral world and Doric subjects seem to influence the choices of Eurychius. Of the 14 transmitted poems of Eurychius, 7 have Doric, and in 4 of these it is apparently for its pastoral associations. So number 6 on the handout, ox herds sacrificing to Pan, 7, dogs frightening off wolves, 8, Pan promising success to hunters, and reworking a Leonidas poem, which is also there on handout 8. And then 4th, handout 9, an epitaph for a cowherd. And in each case, I've printed in bold the key Doric features. On the other hand, 2 other poems of Eurychius seem to choose Doric because of their subject. Handout 10, the subject is a statue of Heracles, Gau page comment, severer Doric dialect. And handout 11, a Spartan mother kills her son who has fled from the battlefield, a good occasion to use Doric. On the other hand, I can see no obvious explanation for Eurychius choosing Doric in handout 13, where a Gallus, who is moving into retirement, dedicates his kit to Cybele. Now, since Eurychius' origin is Cyzicus, one might want to say that his choice of dialect, when he does use Doric, relates to Cyzicene claims to originally have been a Corinthian colony, although it was later refounded by Miletus. But that explanation probably won't work because Doric is not used in any of the inscribed epigrams we have from Cyzicus, of which I put down a couple of examples on the handout. Item 13, a poem on Homer, and item 14, another on the later epic poet Nestor of Laranda. Of course, you could say it's because they're about epic poets that they avoid Doric, but I don't think that's likely. We just don't have any evidence of Doric being used in inscribed poetry from Cyzicus. We have a similar pattern, however, to that of Eurychius in Antipholus of Byzantium, who seems not to use Doric for paradoxography, but does use it in some other contexts. For example, 15, his Leonidean poem for the dedication by Agathomos Parmis, which reworks a Leonidas poem, also dedication by a Parmis. And he Antipholus still, uses Doric for some poems with arguably Doric themes. 16, immortalizing the moment when the Emperor Nero gave freedom to the Doric island of Rhodes. 17, on a painting of Leda and the Swan, an incident that took part by the Laconian river Eurotas. Again, Doric quite appropriate, as also 19 for the corpse of Leonidas, though, as so often, we have some divergence in the manuscript readings, Eleutherias in the Planudian, Eleutheries in P, in the Palatinus. Doric also seems appropriate enough for Antipholus, my item 20, on Timomachus's painting of Medea, because the Medea legend and this scene is set in Doric Corinth. And then 21, Perseus and Andromeda, is about the Argive hero Perseus. But these explanations may be correct or they may not, because if you look at 22 in my handout, a poem on the Iliad and the Odyssey, he has decided to use Doric there, an odd choice for a poem about two epic poems, even if these epic poems are heavily populated by people whom Homer calls Argaioi, Argives. So I'm puzzled about that. I'm also puzzled by Antipholus's choice, by Argentarius's choice for his only Doric epigram out of the quite numerous epigrams of Argentarius to be transmitted. We have 37 Argentarius epigrams. One only, my item 23, is Doric on a carving of Eros on a sphragis. And I really don't know the answer to this one. And by the end of my paper, there will be more questions than there are answers. And I hope some of you will come up with the answers. In the case of Antipholus, we might expect Doric to be his dialect of choice, since he was from Byzantium, it seems, and Byzantium, remembered, it was a Megarian colony. But like Cyzicus, the inscribed epigrams from Byzantium are resolutely Attic-Ionic, and we only find Doric surviving this period of the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, in Byzantium, in personal names like Asclepiadas, or in one or two offices like the Hieromnemon, as opposed to Hieromnemon. Item 24 gives one example. And a nice example of an inscribed epigram of the early 1st century AD from Byzantium is my item 25, a poem with some literary aspirations, but absolutely no scent of Doric at all. That is the background against which I move forward to the 2nd century AD, after the Garland of Philip had been compiled and been circulated, to 5 splendid poems from Nicaea across in Asia Minor. Now, we might approach these epigrams from Nicaea with no expectation that they would be Doric, and if we look at the epigraphic remains from Nicaea, as far as I can see, there is only one Doric poem there, my item 27, on a character Murmex. I don't want to go into Murmex today. There will be enough ant activities during the next 2. More striking, I think, is that in the 31 surviving epigrams of the poet Apollonides in the Garland of Philip, who seems to be from Nicaea, not one of his poems uses Doric, even though one of them is set in Sparta and another is set in Rhodes. Equally, when we get a poem for a character from Nicaea called Diomedes, composed by Diodorus, item 28 in the handout, that too is not in Doric. So we go to Nicaea, we don't really expect any Doric at all. Why should there be Doric in Nicaea? It's quite surprising when we do find that in the 5 poems that I've set out in item 32 in the handout, 3 of these poems, which form a group, are using Doric. These 5, as I mentioned at the beginning, are transmitted by Book 15 of the Palatine Anthology, and there the poems are numbers 4 to 8, numbers I'll try to use in making reference to them. A note in the Palatine manuscript by J tells us that these were sepulchral epigrams, or at least that the first was a sepulchral epigram, copied. Item 29 on the handout gives you the text, copied at Nicaea near the lake on the obelisk, en Nicaea plesion tes limnes en to obelisco. The writer of this note, suggested by Cameron to be Constantine of Rhodes, getting his information perhaps from Alexander, the Metropolitan of Nicaea in the 10th century, is using the term obelisk presumably because that is the architectural form of the monument that he saw, a tomb which that first poem tells the city of Nicaea to boast is as tall as the heavens, a tomb that is a pyramid who is neighbor to the sun, lines 1 to 2 of poem 4, the first poem. So here are poems which were inscribed, I shall argue, in the 2nd century, which were still there to be read in the 10th century, and they're moving into the anthology at a very late stage. They're therefore not subject to the many stages of correction or hypercorrection that most of the poems in the anthology have been, because they have moved from the Hellenistic period through garlands like that of Meleager and Philip. Back to this obelisk, it was clearly similar to another obelisk still standing, that of Cassius Philiscus, some 5 kilometers outside Nicaea, whichever every tourist to Nicaea ought to go to see. That obelisk of Philiscus was erected around 120. It's certainly not the same as the one on which the poems were inscribed, because it is 5 kilometers out of town, away from the lake. I'm not going to have time to go through each of these poems in the detail that I think they deserve. I pick out merely 1 or 2 aspects. The obelisk had an apex of beaten gold, and the man whose tomb it constituted had a priesthood in succession to his father. He assisted his city to recover from disaster, poem 7, 3 to 4. He died and was cremated not in Bithynia, but in Attica, several references there, and from Attica his ashes were brought back to Nicaea. I've put these together in item 33 if you don't want to read through all the poems, but I hope you do. Poem 7 adds the detail that this man had a priesthood, as did his father, which was a priesthood of heavenly mysteries, orgia phantas ura nu, and that the tomb was constructed by his son, who had the same name as Zacchaeus' father, common Greek pattern, name of grandfather, name of father, name of son, grandfather and son, same name, different from father. This also offers the crucial detail that the city's restoration was achieved by the gifts of Ausonian Zeus, Doros Ausonioio Dios, and Louis Robert, whose name I expect will occur very frequently, certainly should occur very frequently over the next days. Louis Robert was surely right to see this as decisive evidence that we're dealing with sepulchral epigrams which praise the virtues of a Hadrianic, not of a 4th century individual, and right in referring the earthquake to that of 120 AD, or rather referring the disaster to the earthquake of 120 AD and not to some 4th century earthquake. For commemoration of Hadrian's help to Nicomedia, the adjacent city to Nicaea, in the crisis following the earthquake or earthquakes of 120, see an illustration I've put on the final page of the handout, item 44, also advertising a book by a colleague of Sanna in the University of Southern Denmark, which I urge all friends of Bithynia to read. But that shows Hadrian assisting Nicomedia. and description of Hadrian, whom I take to be Ausonian Zeus of poem 7. Description of Hadrian as Ausonian Zeus is, of course, not surprising once he had begun to be honored as Hadrianus Zeus Olympius sometime late in the 120s. So we have probably a sequence of disaster 120, assistance shortly after 120, but this character dying and his tomb being erected after 128. It's not certain what sort of priesthood Sacerdos held, but most likely it was one of the imperial cult, sometimes presented as mysteries, which would suit the teletai of poem 8. And there is no difficulty in supposing an imperial cult in Nicaea, which by this time had passed at least once from father to son, which is not to say it had become formally hereditary, but these things can happen in well-organized societies. And one can see why this man's father had the confidence to name his son Sacerdos, a name not rare in Asia Minor, but a name, if you give it to your son, you may well expect him to succeed you in that high office. The reference to Sacerdos as Hierophantes, poem 4, certainly suits a priest of the imperial cult. And here I turn to another Nicaean, item 38 on the handout, Cassius Christos, whose late 1st century sarcophagus we have. It was found outside the East Gate, and it describes him as an Archerius and Sebastophantes, and indicates that he died at the young age of 58. Another text we have describes him as Hierophant of the Mysteries. We know quite a bit about this man, Cassius Christos. He was in charge of work on 2 of the major gates of Nicaea in the years of Vespasian, 70 to 79, in the proconsulate of Marcus Plancius Varus, to whom in another text he presents himself as a philos, item 39 on the handout. One oddity of these 5 poems on Sacerdos is that neither the father nor the son are named. The son had erected the obelisk when Sacerdos had died, and the grandfather of that son is mentioned, but nowhere is the name of either that son or the grandfather. Very odd, but not so odd if item 40 you look at poem 7, which I think reveals covertly their names. 7, Nama demoi perisamon homonymos hurata papo pais emos. My famed memorial was devised by my son, who has his grandfather's name. Had arata, luce is amphoterus. Arata looks upon both of them. Now, not many Greek names actually mean virtuous. For example, the name Agathos is not used in Bithynia except in a compound, but we do have the name Christos used to mean good, of course with a shift of accent from Christos to Christos, regularly found where nouns or adjectives are used as personal names. The father of Sacerdos, I think, is therefore certainly Christos. He is the man whom I'd just been discussing, Gaius Cassius Christos, the man who rebuilt the east and west gates of Nicaea in the reign of Vespasian. So the full name of the man whose tomb obelisk was copied, poems were copied in the 10th century, was Gaius Cassius Sacerdos. And he will have taken on the position of Archerius and Sebastophantes on his father's death, on the death of Christus, perhaps around 100, and will himself have died sometime in the 120s. He joins Cassius Asclepiodotus, Cassius Faliscus, and later Cassius Dio Cocianus, the historian, as a distinguished member of one of the leading families in imperial Nicaea, the Cassii. Now, what was Sacerdos doing in Attica, where he was died and cremated? It presumably had something to do with his intellectual and rhetorical eminence, which I think is referred to in line 6 of poem 5. Well, it is certainly referred to, though in what terms can be debated. Ton phrenos e glossas acta lachonta gera. I can't answer the question why he was in Attica. Merkelbach thought he may have been there for the dedicatory event of the Panhellenion. I'm not sure that he was still alive then. And I think he was probably there for intellectual improvement of one sort or another. And it is intellectual improvement, paideia, that is coming out in the choice of one of his poets of the Doric dialect. 3 poems in Doric, 2 poems not in Doric. I'm not sure whether this indicates that we're dealing with 2 poets, and it's very possible that 2 or more poets were involved in commemoration of such a great man in Nicaea as this, or it may be a single poet showing that he can do different sorts of things. If there is a single poet in this northern Aegean area who is using Doric in the Hadrianic period, one candidate, but only one candidate, is Marcus of Byzantium, item 43 on the handout, a sophist from Byzantium, whom we know to have flourished in the reign of Hadrian. Well, I think that what I've been talking about has taken us rather outside the broader range of what most other people will be talking about. I hope I've been able to contribute a little to a big picture. I can't explain why these Doric poems are there. I think what is important is to be able to ask the question, what is going on in a quite important city in Bithynia, one of the 2 top cities in Bithynia, that a poet commissioned to write epigrams for the obelisk of one of their greatest citizens should go this way, 3 poems in Doric, and the passers-by, if they read, will also ask the question, why Doric? Perhaps, like us, they will all give different answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ewan, for this wide-ranging survey. And thanks to the limited to the aspect of time of the speakers, we have still 10 minutes for questions. Please.
Thank you very much.
There should be a microphone now.
Oh.
In front of you.
Okay. High technology.
Is
okay.
it working?
Okay.
Yes. Okay. I have a question for Professor Kleiman. Thank you very much. I enjoyed your paper. I'm even a Petrovich, so it was so much fun to hear more thoughts about this epigram, which I also think is amazing. On the sweating statue, there was an anecdote which I imagine would have been famous in the generation after Alexander, that's in Plutarch, and I think other writers as well, that when Alexander was preparing his expedition, a statue of Athena was sweating, and this was interpreted as a good omen, indicating that she, as the goddess of warriors, is preparing for big things. So if Callimachus' Berenike is sweating, and the sweating of statues announces war, it would make sense to think of Callimachus' constant talking about literary wars and battles and him being attacked. So if this epigram indeed is announcing the second half of the Aetia, it might sort of go back to the beginning of the Aetia reply to the Talcans and sort of be announcing war activities that are going to emerge and Callimachus' need to defend himself from attacks. However, what confuses me is keti. Now, kai eti miroisi notei implies that the second action is temporally or causally related to the previous action, which is why Andre and I thought of anointing of statue after it has been made. So how would you explain keti? Because if the statue is sweating, I imagine words would be used to announce this as a great portent or signposting a surprising thing, not a result of the previous action.
Now, this is working now, yes? Okay. Well, thank you very much for that comment, and especially for your paper, which really set me thinking about this particular epigram. It's really, I thought, a splendid piece of scholarship. And I also want to make clear, which I didn't have time to do in the paper, that even if Callimachus here is describing a sweating statue, it doesn't mean that it isn't related to his literary endeavors. It's only necessary to think, I think, of his description of the statue in the 6th Iamb, which is a very detailed technical description, which is very much about craftsmanship and art and the relationship between the two. So with Callimachus, nothing is only one thing. There's always more. And so this statue can, in this epigram, can be a sweating statue, but also refer to coming literary wars. I like that idea very much. As far as the temporal question goes, I mean, how one interprets Keti is interesting. In my translation here, I used the English word already. Now, it's true that that meaning of eti is usually applied when the verb is in the past tense, and here it's in the present, but most of the evidence for that is earlier rather than late, and I wasn't sure whether with Callimachus it couldn't take on that meaning, even in the present tense. That is, the statue has just now been made, and no sooner has it been made, but it's sweating. So that's how I interpreted it, basically.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question, please. The microphone.
Okay. Yes, you're going to hate me for this because you asked me about this epigram, but I do wonder whether your Argentarius Doric epigram with the carving of Eros on a Sphragus, your item number 23, it could possibly, I mean, could it be relating to Corinth? Is that why it's Doric? Because as I see it, it has a lot of affiliations with and is possibly molded over Prosodipus 14 AB, which is also a Sphragus, clearly with Corinthian ancestry in that it's with Pegasus. And the focus, or at least that's what I've written about it, the focus of that epigram is very much about the myth of Athena Kalinitis and the idea of reining in Pegasus. So I think it's worth looking at that epigram and seeing the parallels, because both of them are about riders. Of course, there's something topical about the word use, but I think it might be related to it.
Thank you very much. You said 14 AB? That is my next port of call.
We have time for one more short question. Okay. Oh, okay, please. Sorry.
Could you?
Microphone.
Yes, another thought about the same poem, that perhaps if in fact it is some kind of occasional poem for a particular object, it could make a reference to the Doric ethnicity of the owner, which would be something that would disappear from the manuscript tradition altogether, because I'm quite convinced that obviously a lot of these references are just very personal and mark someone as having a certain ethnicity.
Thank you.
Okay. Still couple of minutes. Benjamin.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is Professor Kleiman. I still like the idea that the Muroisi are perfumes, but if you want to go with the idea that it's sweat, just to follow up on Ivana, there's the tradition that Alexander's sweat was like honey, and that might be worth, I mean, that might support that interpretation. I have an odd idea about the poem, but I'm not sure how far it would go, which would be, so Berenice is queen, and she's the fourth Grace. She's also, isn't she the fourth queen of, I mean, if you don't count the first one, the first wife of Ptolemy the First, at this point you would include Arsinoe the First because that's her husband's mother. So it's a I mean, I don't know that that would work as a reading, but it's an interesting question that with the addition of Berenice, you would now have, if you take the Caritas as in Doric, Macedonian or Cyrenaean queens, that might be just worth a note.
That's a very interesting idea, Ben. I guess the question is, was Arsinoe the First somehow banned from, from speech? I mean, could one speak of her in a positive way? I'm not sure, but that would be definitely something to look into. And thank you for the reference to Alexander's sweet sweat, too. That fits beautifully with the thesis.
So now we are just in time for the stop and the coffee break. Thank you.